So hello, this is Embroidery Basics. This is super basic embroidery tips and tricks and a couple of stitches that will help get you started on doing embroidery at home. My name is Rachel Hobson, and I'm a contributing writer at Craftscene. Can you hear better? Is that better? I'm a contributing writer at Craftscene.com, and I also have my own blog called Average Jane Crafter, and I teach hand embroidery classes back in Austin, Texas, which is where I live. So today, getting to talk to you about embroidery is so awesome for me because it's my favorite thing to do in the world. It makes me incredibly happy. I can literally, like, the first stitch that I pull through the fabric, my whole body just gets happy and warm, and it is so much fun. I love embroidery because it's really cheap, and it's also really portable. So the first thing I'm going to tell you guys about are the different tools that you're going to need to get started with embroidery. So the first thing you need is an embroidery hoop, and that's one of these things. If you've done cross stitch as a kid or anything like that, you're probably familiar with these. They come in all different kinds of sizes. I like to use hoops that are in the 4 to 7 inch range because they're just the right size for my hand to hold and to put in the bag and kind of take with me. The other thing you're going to need is embroidery floss. So when you go to the store, you're going to see, can y'all see this on the monitor there? You're going to see hundreds of colors of floss like this. I like getting DMC or Placentia as opposed to the giant packs of cheap off-brand floss that you can get. As cheap as I am, like, I'm a super frugal girl, but I like to spend the 29 cents on my skein of DMC because it's actually smoother and it's easier to, you know, get through the fabric, and it doesn't knot up as much, and, you know, you want to kind of go for easier, not harder. So they're called skeins, and they'll have these little wrappers on them. They have a number on the end, and that's the color number. And you wouldn't think, like, oh, I'm never going to need that number, that's never going to be important. But it actually kind of is, because once you finish with this skein of floss, you go into this store, there's no way you're going to be able to remember exactly what color it was. And with the lighting, it's different, it's weird. So try to keep that little piece of paper. So embroidery floss is made up of 6 strands of thread twisted together. And typically in traditional embroidery, they separate out the strands of floss for a finer, more delicate look. If you're going for a chunkier look, like Sublime Stitching, I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with Sublime Stitching, but Jenny Hart is an artist based in Austin. She's kind of helped bring really cool and hip embroidery back. And she's known for her really chunky, bold, graphic look to her embroidery. And that's because she uses all 6 strands of embroidery floss. So sometimes when you're doing embroidery and you'll see instructions for it, and they'll say something about use 6 strands or 3 strands or 2 strands, that's just meaning take your embroidery floss, and the way I like to separate it out is just holding it in my hands with my finger and thumb like that, and then I twist my finger and thumb in opposite directions, and that gets all the threads to line up straight like that. So I twist it in opposite directions, stick my thumbnail, or, you know, lack thereof, in there, and separate, count out how many ever strands of floss I need, and then I put my thumbs in like this and pull out from the side. Because what happens is if you have a really long piece of embroidery floss, it may not happen with this one, but if you pull down like this, it starts to knot down at the bottom. So if you go in from the middle and then just kind of gently work your way out, that's a nice way to keep it from getting it all tangled up. Okay, so then obviously you need needles, embroidery needles. You can buy them, they have packs of them in the needle arts section. Embroidery needles, $1.50. They'll have sizes like 1 to 5 or 5 to 10. The smaller the number, the larger the needle, the larger the eye of the needle. It's a little bit thicker. Again, it's just kind of based on what kind of floss you're working with, what kind of fabric you're working with. That's what you can use. You need some good embroidery scissors. So this is probably the most expensive thing you'll get, and it can still only be like 5 to 12. Or maybe like $30 if you get like a really fancy pair. Those little tiny scissors like that are great for getting at the back of your fabric, for snipping your threads, doing all that kind of stuff. It's hard if you've got a big honking pair of scissors to get in there and use. And you'll get to where you really love your little tiny pair of embroidery scissors. And you can take them on airplanes. So inevitably when I'm teaching a class, people say, I want to make baby onesies. I want to stitch on my t-shirt. And that's awesome. Knit fabric is really hard to stitch on without stabilizer. So you can get stabilizer. This is one that Sublime Stitching sells. You can also get it at any fabric store. If you go in and say, I need t-shirt stabilizer, or I need fabric stabilizer for hand embroidery, they can show you. And what this is it's like a heavy paper, and you can iron it onto the back of your fabric. As you stitch, every stitch you take perforates that paper. So at the end of your stitching, you can just turn it over and you kind of push your hands up on the back of the fabric, and the paper starts to tear, and then you just tear it and pull it away. So next, how do you get the images onto your fabric? There's lots of different ways. So the most common way is to use an iron-on. So you'll get a sheet, and it'll have an image on it like this. And this is special ink that can iron onto your fabric, and it can also be reused. So depending on how hard you press and how hot your iron is, you can actually reuse this transfer several times. Here are my couple of tips from mistakes that I've made. Put a pressing cloth, which is just like a fancy name for a piece of cotton. Like I use old dish towels or old pillowcases that are stained. Put that under your fabric that you're ironing onto. Like if you're on an ironing board, you want to put that down, because what happens, especially with the Sublime Stitching transfers, because they're super juicy, they bleed right through to your ironing board. And so my ironing board is covered in embroidery transfers. And be careful, because you can burn your fingers really easily too if you're holding it like this and burn your hand. So that's ironing on a transfer. Another way that you can do it is with a light box method. And if you don't have a light box at home, which is just, like a little box with light shining up through it, you can use a bright sunny window. So just tape your image up to a window, tape your fabric over it, and use a little water-soluble pen and trace it out. And then you've got your image. And then all you have to do is spritz it with water or even dribble water on it, and it comes right off. So the last method that you can use is with carbon paper. And all you'd have to do is put your fabric down and put down the carbon paper, carbon side down, and then put your image on top of that and trace it with a ballpoint pen. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you some stitches. I'm going to show you 3 basic stitches that will get you able to stitch anything you want. So I'm coming up from the back of the fabric, and if I had my line for my transfer, I would just come up on that line. I'm going to pull my needle all the way through, and then I'm going to move over a stitch length. Now for you guys today, I'm making ginormous stitches. I'm doing this on a big scale so you can see it on the TV. Stitch lengths are generally like 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch long. You're going for consistent, even stitches. Whatever size you want to make them, just have fun with it. So I'm going to move over a stitch length and go down, and I've made my first stitch. So from here, and I'm going to end up making a crooked line, I know, but from here I'm moving ahead a stitch length past that stitch, like this, and then I'm going down back in that last hole of the previous stitch, hence the name back stitch. So I'm going back in. So the next stitch I'm going to show you is a split stitch, and it starts out just like the back stitch, except the difference is that instead of coming out one stitch ahead, you come up right in the middle of the stitch that you made previously. Moving ahead one stitch length, going down, and then this time, like I said, instead of coming out over here, what I'm going to do is come up right in the middle of this stitch. So I'm actually splitting that stitch in half. Then I'm moving ahead one stitch length from there, coming up in the middle. And you just continue on this way. So the way this stitch looks a little bit different than the back stitch is the back stitch kind of tends to give you a very chomp, 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 chomp look. This one gives you a little bit smoother look. It's kind of ropey and braided looking. The last one I'm going to show you is the satin stitch. Satin stitch is a filling stitch, so if you have something like her eyes are done in satin stitch, her cheeks are done in satin stitch, and it's just basically getting your thread going back and forth, lining it up as close to each other as possible. So I start up from the back just like this. I'm just going to do like a rectangle of satin stitch. And again, I'm doing this on giant scale. So back like this, and then I come up, and I'm going to come up as close to that stitch as I can and go back down. And so the goal is getting your stitches as close together as possible without the fabric showing in between. So that's the satin stitch. It's just back and forth, back and forth. So with these stitches, Okay, this piece right here, 95% of it is done in the 3 stitches that I just showed you. And so anything that you get, you can do with those stitches. There's some extra ones like the lazy daisies that make the little flower patterns. Those are my very favorites. French knots, those are my second favorites. You know, there's a couple of other things, but really with the back stitch, the split stitch, and the satin stitch, you can get started on, you know, pretty much anything you want to do from there.